The cashier told her that her card was declined. She tried to return the baby formula, and her 4-year-old daughter asked, "Mommy, is Rosalind going to be hungry again?" Again. That one word changed everything, because the man standing behind her in line was no ordinary man, and what he discovered that night when he followed her home made him do something that would change everything. The fluorescent lights of the Kroger on Westheimer buzzed like dying insects. Houston heat still clung to the parking lot outside, but inside, the air conditioning hummed a sterile lullaby over near-empty aisles. Most of the city had already gone home. The self-checkout machines blinked in patient silence. A janitor pushed a mop in slow, meditative circles near the frozen section. Johnny Thorne stood at checkout lane 4, placing a single bottle of Macallan 18 on the conveyor belt. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the top button undone. His watch, a Patek Philippe, caught the light when he moved. He wasn't in a rush. Men like Johnny were never in a rush. The world adjusted its tempo to them. He owned 3 construction firms, a logistics company that moved cargo through the port of Houston, 2 restaurants in Montrose, a wine bar in the Heights. On paper, he was a businessman. Beneath the paper, beneath the spreadsheets, and the tax filings, and the handshake deals with city councilmen, he was something else entirely. Something quieter. Something that made certain men, in certain rooms, lower their voices when his name was mentioned. He was 35. Widowed at 31. His wife, Noor, had died in a car accident that wasn't entirely an accident. He'd spent 2 years untangling that truth. When he found it, the men responsible didn't face a courtroom. They faced something worse, something that left no evidence and no witnesses. Since then, Johnny Thorne had lived like a man with a sealed room in his chest, furnished but locked. He slept alone. He ate alone. He moved through the world like smoke through a doorway, present but impossible to hold. The cashier scanned his bottle. He reached for his wallet. That's when he heard it. A small voice, high-pitched, trembling at the edges. "Is Rosalind going to be hungry again?" Again. That word didn't float. It landed. It hit the floor of his chest like a coin dropped in a cathedral. Again. Implied before. Again implied pattern. Again implied a child who had already learned that hunger was not an emergency. It was a schedule. Johnny turned his head. 3 lanes over, a woman stood at the register with her back slightly curved, as if she were trying to fold herself smaller. She held a baby against her chest, maybe 5 months old, wrapped in a thin blanket that had been washed too many times. Beside her, clutching the hem of her coat, stood a girl. 3, maybe 4 years old. Brown hair pulled into a lopsided ponytail, eyes too wide for her age. The woman's card had been declined. She was holding a canister of baby formula, Enfamil, the large one, and she was trying to return it. "I'm sorry," she said to the cashier. Her voice was quiet. Not just quiet, compressed, like she'd trained herself to take up as little space as possible. "Can you just take this off? I'll figure something out." The cashier, a teenager with braces, looked uncomfortable. I already scanned it. I need to call a manager for a void." The woman flinched, not at the words, at the idea of waiting, of being seen, of standing there while someone with authority walked over and looked at her and understood that she couldn't afford to feed her baby. "It's fine," she whispered. "I'll just leave it. I'm sorry." She apologized for existing. Johnny watched her fingers tremble as she placed the formula on the counter. He watched the way she pulled the baby closer, not in affection, but in defense, as if the child were a shield and a wound at the same time. The little girl tugged her mother's coat again. "Mommy, is Rosalind going to be hungry again?" The mother didn't answer. She pressed her lips together and blinked 3 times, fast, like she was trying to hold something behind her eyes. Then she bent down and kissed the girl's forehead. "No, baby. Mommy's going to fix it." But she didn't know how. Johnny could see that. The lie lived in her shoulders. He moved, not dramatically, not heroically, He simply stepped out of his lane, walked to the cashier at lane 7, and placed his card on the counter beside the formula. "Ring it," he said. The cashier blinked. The woman turned. Her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. And in that second, Johnny saw the entire inventory of her suffering. Shame, gratitude, rage, exhaustion, the specific kind of pride that only exists in people who have been stripped of everything except their refusal to beg. "You don't have to," she started. "It's done," he said. Not cold, not warm, just factual. The way you'd tell someone the sun had already set. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask her name. He didn't smile. He took his Macallan, nodded once, not at her, but at something internal, some private calculation, and walked toward the exit. The automatic doors opened. The Houston night breathed against his face. He reached his car, a black Escalade with tinted windows, and placed the bottle on the passenger seat. He sat there, engine off. He watched the entrance. 3 minutes later, she came out, the baby on her chest, the girl holding her hand. A single plastic bag in the other. She walked with the kind of speed that comes not from purpose, but from the desire to disappear. She turned left, past the parking lot, toward the sidewalk. No car. She was walking. At 9:47 p.m. in Houston, with a baby and a 3-year-old. Johnny started the engine. He followed her, not fast, not close. He kept 3 blocks of distance, his headlights off for the last 2 turns. She walked for nearly 20 minutes, cutting through a neighborhood that smelled like exhaust and fried food, past a check-cashing place with bars on the windows, past a laundromat still open with a man sleeping inside. She entered an apartment complex on Cullen Boulevard. The kind of building that had been beige once, but was now the color of surrender. Cracked, stairwells, a security light that flickered like a dying heartbeat, a dumpster overflowing near the entrance. She climbed to the 2nd floor. Apartment 2C. The door closed behind her. Johnny parked across the street. He turned off the engine. He sat in the dark and watched the window. A light came on. Then, nothing. 37 minutes later, another car pulled in. A dented Dodge Charger with a cracked tail light. A man got out. Late 20s, maybe 30. Tall, unsteady. He walked like a man who had had 4 beers and thought he'd had 2. He climbed the stairs. Apartment 2C. The door opened. Closed. And then, through the thin walls, through the cracked window, through the humid night air, Johnny heard it. A voice, male, loud, not shouting yet, but loaded. The kind of voice that carries its violence in its rhythm, not its volume. "You spent how much? On what? You can't even buy formula, Eloan. You had 1 job, 1, and you couldn't even do that." Silence. "Look at this place. Look at you. You think anyone else would put up with this? With you, you'd be on the street without me. You and those kids. You know that, right?" Silence. "Say something." Silence. Then, the baby crying, sharp, thin, terrified. Then, the little girl. "Daddy, please don't yell." Then, his voice again, quieter now, worse, the kind of quiet that cuts deeper than screaming. "See what you did? You upset the kids. Every single time, Eloan. Every single time it's you." Silence. That silence. Johnny had heard men scream. He'd heard men beg. He'd heard bones break and breath stop. But nothing, nothing, sounded like a woman who had been taught that her silence was the only currency she had left. He gripped the steering wheel. His knuckles went white. He whispered, to himself, to the dark, to whatever part of him still believed in something. "I can't stay with my arms crossed." Johnny did not go to the police. He did not knock on the door. He did not confront the man in the parking lot. That is what amateurs do. Men ruled by impulse, by the fantasy of heroism. Johnny understood something most people didn't. Violence without strategy is just noise, and noise fades. He wanted architecture. He wanted the kind of dismantling that looks like gravity, inevitable, quiet, and impossible to appeal. The next morning he sat in his office on the 42nd floor of a building he technically didn't own, but effectively controlled. He called Mercer, his intelligence man, former NSA contractor, currently a ghost who lived in a condo in Clear Lake and collected vintage typewriters. I need everything on a man named Briggs Ledford, lives on Cullen Boulevard, apartment 2C, late 20s, maybe early 30s. Drives a Dodge Charger with a cracked right tail light. Mercer didn't ask why. He never asked why. That was his most valuable quality. Within 48 hours, Johnny had a file. Briggs Ledford, age 31, employed at a plumbing supply warehouse in Stafford. Annual salary, $41,000. Child support from a previous relationship. Unpaid. 3 credit cards, all maxed. A DUI from 2 years ago, reduced to a misdemeanor. A pattern of workplace complaints, showing up late, smelling like alcohol, verbal altercations with coworkers. But the interesting part wasn't the surface, it was underneath. Briggs had been skimming, nothing dramatic. An extra few hundred here, a phantom supply order there. He'd been filing false expense reports through his company's vendor system for nearly a year. Total estimated amount. Just under $19,000, not enough to trigger an internal audit. But more than enough to trigger a federal one, if someone knew where to point the flashlight. Johnny closed the file. He didn't smile. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt something colder and more patient. The feeling of a man who has found the exact thread that, when pulled, will unravel everything. But not yet. First, he needed to understand the full picture, because the woman, Elowen, wasn't just a victim of a bad man. She was trapped in a system, and Johnny had learned long ago that you can't free someone by destroying their cage if they don't know the door is open. Over the next 2 weeks, Johnny watched. Not every night, not obsessively, but enough. He learned the rhythm. Mondays, Briggs came home sober. He'd play with Ivy, the older girl, for about 15 minutes. He'd hold the baby, Rosalind, and make sounds that were supposed to be fatherly. He'd tell Elowen she looked nice, even though she wore the same 3 shirts in rotation. On those nights, Johnny almost doubted himself, almost thought he'd misread the situation, because the man laughing on the couch, bouncing a baby on his knee, didn't look like a monster. He looked like a father, and that was the most dangerous part, because it meant Elowen saw it too. She saw the man she wished he was, and she clung too. That version, the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. Tuesdays through Thursdays, the drinking escalated. The comments started small. Why isn't dinner ready? Became you can't do anything right. Became my mother warned me about women like you. One Wednesday night, Johnny heard a conversation that made him pull out a notepad and write down every word. Not for evidence, for understanding. Briggs had come home with flowers. Dollar store carnations, still wrapped in cellophane. He'd handed them to Elowen and said, "I got these for you, because I love you. You know that, right?" She'd taken them. "Thank you, Briggs. I just feel like you don't appreciate me sometimes. Like I work all day, and I come home and you're sitting here and the apartment's a mess, and the kids are crying, and I need you to try harder, El, for us." "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, just be better." The cruelty of that exchange wasn't in its volume, it was in its structure. He'd wrapped an insult in a gift, he'd delivered contempt in the packaging of love, and she'd accepted both, the flowers and the blade, because she could no longer tell the difference. This was not a man who hit, this was something more insidious. This was a man who had figured out that you don't need fists when you have words, that the most effective cage isn't made of bars, it's made of beliefs. And he had spent years building Elowen's cage, brick by brick, insult by insult, until she lived inside it voluntarily. By Friday, the cycle peaked. The yelling, the accusations, the sound of something hitting a wall. Not her, not yet, but close enough to make the distinction irrelevant. The terror was the weapon. The proximity of violence was the violence. One Friday, Johnny heard something that stopped his breathing. Briggs was drunk, drunker than usual. His words were slurring, but the venom was precise. "You know what? I should leave. I should just walk out that door and never come back. See how long you last. A week? 2? Before you come crawling back. Before you realize that no one is ever going to want you. Look at you. 2 kids. No degree, no job. You're not even pretty anymore, Elawan. You used to be, but now you're just tired. Tired and used up. The baby started crying. Ivy's voice. Mommy, can I sleep in your room tonight? Elawan's voice cracked but controlled. Come here, baby. Come to mommy. And then Briggs. Great. Turn the kids against me too. That's your specialty, isn't it? Making everyone feel sorry for you. A door closed. Elawan had taken the children to the bedroom. She'd removed them from the blast radius, not because someone told her to, because she'd become an expert in triage. She couldn't stop the bomb, but she could control the shrapnel. Johnny sat in the car with his eyes closed. His hands were fists. His jaw ached from clenching. He thought about going up there. He thought about knocking on that door and showing Briggs Ledford what it felt like to be small. He had the physical capacity. He had the connections to make it look like anything he wanted. But he didn't move. Because this wasn't about him. This wasn't about his anger, or his grief, or his guilt about Noor. This was about a woman and 2 children who needed a permanent solution, not a dramatic one. Saturday mornings. The apology. Johnny watched through the window one Saturday as Briggs sat on the couch with Elawan. He was crying. Actual tears. His head in his hands. His voice carrying through the thin glass. I don't know what's wrong with me, El. I swear I'm trying. It's just work. And the money. And I feel like I'm failing you. I'm failing the girls. I love you so much. And I get so scared of losing you that He didn't finish. He pulled her close. She let him. Her body was stiff at first. The rigidity of a woman who has been hurt by the same hands now holding her. But then, slowly, her shoulders dropped. Her hand went to the back of his head. She stroked his hair. It's okay, she whispered. We'll figure it out. That was the moment Johnny almost lost his composure, not at the abuse, not at the yelling, but at the forgiveness, because he recognized what it was, not love, but survival, trauma bonding, the neurological hijacking that happens when someone alternates between cruelty and tenderness until the victim's brain can no longer distinguish between the two. The dopamine hit of relief becomes indistinguishable from affection. The absence of pain becomes the definition of love. Elawan wasn't stupid. She wasn't weak. She was conditioned. And that was worse, because it meant that even if Briggs disappeared tomorrow, the cage would remain. It had been built inside her. Johnny had Mercer pull more. Elawan Pierce, age 27, born in Beaumont, Texas, parents deceased, father from a heart attack when she was 16, mother from cervical cancer 2 years later, raised by an aunt who died the year Elawan turned 20. No siblings, no inheritance. A year and a half of community college, abandoned when she got pregnant with Ivy. She had no one. No safety net. No family. No savings. No car, no credit, no friends. Briggs had seen to that, slowly, methodically, the way abusers always do. First isolating, then controlling, then convincing the victim that the isolation was her own choice. You don't need those people. They don't care about you like I do. Your friends are a bad influence. I'm the only one who really loves you. Until the only voice she heard was his. And it told her she was nothing. One evening, Johnny watched Elawan walk to the small playground behind the apartment complex. Ivy ran ahead. Elawan sat on a bench with Roslyn in her arms. The sun was setting, turning the sky the color of a bruised peach. A woman from another apartment, older, maybe 50, sat beside her. They talked briefly. The woman, Afum, offered her a cigarette. Elawan shook her head. You okay, honey? The woman asked. Elawan paused for a long time. Then she smiled. The kind of smile that has nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with performance. Yeah, just tired. The woman nodded. She'd heard that word before. Every woman in that building had. Tired was code. Tired was a locked door with a do not enter sign. Tired meant, I am drowning, but I have learned to drown quietly. Johnny watched from across the street. He sat in a different car each time, a gray Camry today, borrowed from a fleet he kept for exactly these kinds of operations. He wore a plain jacket. No watch, no cufflinks, just a man sitting in a car. But his jaw was tight, and his hands, those hands that had signed contracts worth millions, that had once held a dying woman in a hospital room, that had closed around throats in dark hallways, those hands were trembling, not from rage, from recognition. He saw Noor, not literally. Elowen looked nothing like her, but the shape of the suffering was the same, the architecture of helplessness, the way a woman folds inward when the world has taught her that expanding is dangerous. Noor hadn't been abused, but she'd been taken, stolen by violence, and Johnny had arrived too late. He'd had all the power in the world, and he'd been too late. He would not be too late again. But before he moved, he needed to know one more thing. He needed to know if Elowen was ready. Not ready to leave. She might never be ready in the way people who've never been trapped imagine readiness. But ready to accept an opening, ready to see a door. He got his answer on a Tuesday night. Briggs was asleep on the couch. The TV was on, casting blue shadows across the room. The apartment was quiet. Elowen sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. She was writing something. Slowly, deliberately, the pen gripped tight. Johnny couldn't read the words from across the street, but he could see her face. And her face told him everything. She wasn't writing a letter. She wasn't making a list. She was calculating, adding numbers, subtracting expenses, trying to figure out if there was a mathematical path out of her life. She wrote for 45 minutes. Then she closed the notebook, pressed her palms against her eyes, and sat perfectly still for a long time. She was looking for the door. She just couldn't find it yet. Johnny pulled out his phone and made a call. Mercer, move forward. It began on a Tuesday. Briggs arrived at work to find his supervisor waiting for him, not with a task, with a letter. The company had received a formal notification from the IRS regarding discrepancies in vendor payments linked to his department. An internal audit had been initiated. It's probably nothing, his supervisor said, but his eyes said otherwise. Briggs went home that night sober, not by choice but by fear. He paced the apartment. He made phone calls. He spoke in hushed, frantic tones to someone Elowen couldn't identify. Someone's coming after me, he told her. Someone at work is trying to set me up. Elowen said nothing. She fed Rosalind. She braided Ivy's hair. She moved through the apartment like water around a stone. But inside something was shifting. She recognized this behavior, the paranoia, the blame, the need to cast himself as the victim. She'd seen it every time consequences approached him. He never said, I made a mistake. He said, someone is doing this to me. The world was always the aggressor. He was always the innocent. And for the first time, she didn't believe him. The next day, Briggs was called into a meeting with HR. The audit had found irregularities, $18,700 in falsified vendor invoices submitted under his employee ID. He was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. That night, he drank and he yelled and he threw a glass against the wall and it shattered 3 feet from where Ivy was sitting on the floor with a coloring book. Ivy didn't scream. She didn't cry. She picked up her coloring book and walked to the bedroom and closed the door. She was 4 years old, and she had already learned the protocol. Elowen stood in the kitchen. Her hands were at her sides. Her eyes were dry. This is your fault, Briggs said. Everything that's happening to me, it's because of you. Because I have to take care of you and those kids. Because I'm stressed. Because you can't contribute anything. You're a drain. You hear me? A drain. She looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, something shifted in her expression. Not anger. She was too exhausted for anger, but clarity. A small, fragile window of clarity, like a crack in a frozen lake. Maybe, she said quietly. You did this to yourself. Briggs stared at her. The room went silent. Then he laughed, a short, cruel bark. Right, sure. The woman who can't even keep a checking account is giving me life advice. He grabbed his keys and left. The door slammed so hard the baby woke up screaming. Elowen picked up the broken glass, piece by piece, on her hands and knees, And then she sat on the kitchen floor and pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed long, shuddering breaths, and didn't cry, because crying required believing that someone might hear you. And she had stopped believing that a long time ago. But that sentence, "Maybe you did this to yourself," lingered. It was the first time she had pushed back, the first time in years she had reflected his blame instead of absorbing it. It was a small thing, 6 words. But in the architecture of her captivity, those 6 words were a crack in the foundation, and cracks, once started, don't stop. Over the next 10 days, the walls closed in. The IRS audit expanded. A formal investigation was opened. Briggs's bank accounts were flagged, not frozen yet, but monitored. His attorney, a cut-rate lawyer, from a billboard on I-45, told him the potential charges included fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement, misdemeanor at best, felony at worst. Briggs stopped sleeping. He drank more. He showed up at the warehouse, technically still on leave, and got into a shouting match with his supervisor. Security escorted him out. That night, he came home and punched the wall in the hallway. Not her. The wall. But Ivy saw it. She stood in the bedroom doorway, holding a stuffed rabbit, and watched her father's fist go through the drywall. She didn't blink. Later, when Elowen put her to bed, Ivy said something that stopped her mother's heart. "Mommy, is Daddy going to hit us?" "No, baby, Daddy wouldn't. He hits the wall." The wall didn't do anything either. Elowen stared at her daughter, 4 years old, and she understood the logic of escalation better than most adults. That night, after Briggs passed out on the couch, Elowen pulled out the notebook again. She didn't calculate money this time. She wrote a list. 3 items: shelter, job, out. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But for the first time, she was planning an exit, not fantasizing. Planning. The difference is everything. He went home and told Elowen it was a conspiracy, that his boss was jealous, that the IRS was corrupt, that everyone was out to get him. She nodded. She always nodded. The nod was a survival mechanism, an agreement that cost her nothing and prevented escalation. But something had changed. That crack in the frozen lake. It hadn't closed. It had widened. She started doing things she hadn't done in months. She cleaned the apartment not out of fear, but out of agency. She took Ivy to the library. She called the county health clinic and made an appointment for Rosalind's vaccinations. Small things. Tiny acts of sovereignty that no one would notice, except a woman who had been denied them for years. She was thawing, and she didn't know why. 3 weeks after the audit began, 2 federal agents arrived at the apartment at 7:14 a.m. on a Wednesday. Briggs opened the door in his boxers. His eyes were bloodshot. The apartment smelled like stale beer and burnt toast. They showed their badges. They read the charges: wire fraud, filing false federal documents, tax evasion. Briggs said, "This is a mistake." They put him in handcuffs. They walked him down the cracked stairwell of the apartment building, past the flickering security light, past the overflowing dumpster, and into a black sedan. Elowen stood in the doorway. Ivy held her hand. Rosalind slept against her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She watched the car pull away, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years, something so unfamiliar it took her a moment to identify it. Space, not happiness, not relief, not freedom, not yet, just space, the simple, enormous luxury of a room without threat. She closed the door. She locked it. She sat on the couch and held both her children and breathed without counting the seconds until the next eruption. And then she cried, not for him, not for her marriage, not for the future she'd imagined. She cried for the years, for the time she'd spent apologizing for existing, for the version of herself she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten she existed. She cried because her daughter had asked if Daddy was going to hit them. She cried because her baby had never heard a home without yelling. She cried because she'd stayed, and she cried because leaving had never been as simple as people thought. When she was done, she washed her face. She made breakfast. She sat with Ivy at the kitchen table and ate scrambled eggs in a silence that for the first time, felt like peace. Across the street, in a gray Camry, Johnny Thorne watched the federal car disappear around the corner. He made no call. He sent no message. He simply sat in the silence and let it be enough. The charges were financial, not domestic. That was deliberate. If Briggs had been arrested for abuse, the system would have given him a restraining order in 60 days. He'd be out. He'd be angry. He'd be dangerous. But financial crimes? Those came with federal prosecutors, pre-trial detention, asset freezes. The kind of machinery that doesn't forgive and doesn't forget. Johnny had not rescued her. He had removed the obstacle. The difference mattered. 6 weeks passed. Elawan's world didn't transform overnight. That's not how it works. The first week, she didn't leave the apartment except to buy groceries. The second week, she had a panic attack in the cereal aisle because a man behind her raised his voice at his child. The third week, she called a domestic violence hotline and spoke for 40 minutes and cried for the first time in a year. By the fourth week, she had an appointment with a counselor. By the fifth, she had applied for food assistance. By the sixth, she had enrolled Ivy in a Head Start program 3 blocks away. Progress was not linear. Some days she woke up and felt like she could breathe. Other days she woke up and reached for her phone to text Briggs, to apologize for something she hadn't done, to check if he was okay, to make sure he wasn't angry. The phantom limb of trauma bonding. Her therapist called it the echo. The body remembering a rhythm even after the music has stopped. There were setbacks. One morning she received a letter from Briggs's attorney requesting that she testify as a character witness at his bail hearing. She read it 3 times. Her hands shook. Her first instinct, buried deep, wired into her nervous system, was to say yes, to help him, to smooth things over, to be the woman who fixes, who forgives, who makes everything okay. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter and stared at it for an hour. Then she called her therapist. "I want to help him," she said. "I know that's insane. I know he hurt me, but I want to help him and I hate myself for wanting it." Her therapist told her something she'd never forget. "You're not insane. You're in withdrawal. His approval was your drug. Your brain is craving the next hit. But cravings pass. Let this one pass." She didn't testify. She threw the letter away. And that night, she slept without dreaming for the first time in months. She was learning, slowly, painfully, the way a person learns to walk again after breaking both legs, one step at a time with the constant fear that the ground might betray her. It was a Thursday evening when she saw him again. She was at the Kroger. The same one. Same aisle even. The baby formula section. Rosalind was in the cart, gnawing on a teething ring. Ivy was walking beside her, singing a song she'd learned at school. Elawan reached for the unfamiliar. The large canister. She placed it in the cart without flinching. She had money this time. Not much, but enough. Food stamps and a part-time job at a dry cleaner's. It wasn't glamorous. It was, survival with dignity. "That one's on sale this week." She turned. He was standing at the end of the aisle. Same charcoal suit, different tie. His hands were in his pockets. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were not. His eyes held the same controlled intensity she'd seen that night, weeks ago, when he'd placed his card on the counter without asking. She recognized him immediately. "You're the man from the checkout line," he said. "Yeah." Silence, not the kind she was used to. Not loaded, not dangerous, just quiet. The kind of silence that exists between two people who don't yet know what to say but aren't afraid of the space. "I never thanked you," she said. "You don't need to." "I want to." He looked at her. Really looked. The way he looked at problems before solving them. But this wasn't a problem. This was a person. And she was looking back at him with the kind of directness that only comes from someone who has recently stopped lying to themselves. "I'm Johnny," he said. "Elawan. That's a beautiful name. My mother picked it. She said it meant elm tree, something about roots." He almost smiled. Almost. "Roots are good," he said. Ivy appeared from behind the cart. She looked up at Johnny with the fearless curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of tall men. "Are you Mommy's friend?" Johnny crouched down. He was 6'2", and he made himself small deliberately, not because he was told to, but because he understood that the world looks different from 3 feet off the ground. "I'd like to be," he said. Ivy considered this. Then she nodded. A single, decisive nod, as if she'd reviewed his application and found it acceptable. "Okay," she said. "Do you like coloring?" "I haven't tried in a while." "You should. It helps when things are loud." That sentence hit Johnny like a freight train wrapped in a whisper. It helps when things are loud. A 4-year-old survival strategy, delivered without irony, without trauma, without performance. Just fact. He stood up. He looked at Eloan. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't decode, somewhere between gratitude and suspicion, between hope and the refusal to hope. "Can I buy you a coffee sometime?" he asked. "I don't really," she started. "Not a date, just coffee. I know a place where the chairs are comfortable and the staff doesn't rush you." She hesitated. The old programming fired. Don't trust, don't open, don't let anyone in. But the new wiring, fragile and newly installed, whispered something different. "This doesn't feel like a cage." "Okay," she said. Coffee. They met 4 times over the next 3 weeks. The first time at a small cafe on Montrose. She talked about the weather, about Ivy's school, about how Rosalind had started laughing, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly, and how she'd stood in the kitchen and cried when she heard it because she realized she'd never heard her baby laugh without tension in the room. Johnny listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He held his coffee and he listened with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. He noticed things. The way she sat near the exit. The way she checked her phone even though no one was calling. The way she flinched when the barista dropped a mug behind the counter. The cartography of her anxiety, mapped onto every small gesture, the second time she talked about Briggs. Not the details. Not yet, but the architecture, how it started, how it escalated, how she'd spent 2 years believing that love was supposed to feel like walking on glass. The worst part, she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it, wasn't the yelling. It was the quiet after, when he'd be sweet, when he'd bring me flowers or play with the girls, and I'd think, maybe that's the real him, maybe the other version is the lie. She paused, but it was the opposite. The sweetness was the lie. The cruelty was the truth. And I couldn't see it because I needed the lie to survive. Johnny set down his cup. "You weren't blind," he said. "You were surviving. There's a difference." She looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't wipe them. She let the tears sit there openly, like she was testing whether they were allowed to exist in front of another person. "People keep telling me I should have left sooner," she said. "Like it's that easy. Like you can just walk out the door when you have no money, no car, no family, no job, and a man who's convinced you that you'll die without him." "People who say that have never been caged," Johnny said. "Leaving requires more courage than staying. Always." She nodded. Something loosened in her chest. The third time they met, she laughed. Actually laughed. At something he said about Ivy's coloring critique. "She told me my tree looked angry, and honestly she wasn't wrong." The laugh was short, surprised, like a bird startled into flight. But it was real. Johnny felt it land somewhere in his ribs, warm, unfamiliar. He told her about his construction work, the legitimate side, about a community center his company was building in 3rd Ward, about how the architect had designed a reading room with floor-to-ceiling windows because he said, "Kids who can see the sky while they read will dream bigger." "That's beautiful," she said. "It's practical," he corrected, but the corner of his mouth twitched, which was the Johnny Thorne equivalent of a standing ovation. The 4th time, she told him about her parents, about losing them young, about the aunt who raised her, and then died, about the specific kind of loneliness that comes from having no one to call when the world breaks open. "I think that's why I stayed with Briggs," she said. "Not because I loved him, because I was terrified of being alone again, of having no one." He knew that. He used it. "You're not alone now," Johnny said. "You after" was the first time he'd said anything that could be interpreted as personal. And he'd said it simply, without performance, without expectation, the way you'd state a geographical fact. "You're not alone now. The sky's blue. Houston is humid. You're not alone now." She looked at him for a long time. "Who are you, Johnny Thorne?" "A man who pays attention." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." Over the next month, Johnny did what he did best. He built infrastructure. He didn't give her money. He didn't buy her a car. He didn't install himself as a replacement for Briggs. He was careful, surgically careful, about the difference between help and control. He connected her with a legal aid organization that specialized in domestic abuse cases. They assigned her a pro bono attorney who immediately filed for a protective order and began custody proceedings. He put her in touch with a woman named Rhonda Ashwick, who ran a nonprofit that helped single mothers find employment. Within 2 weeks, Elawan had a job. Data entry at a healthcare company in the medical center. It paid $17 an hour. It wasn't wealth, it was foundation. He arranged for Ivy to attend a subsidized daycare affiliated with one of his construction firm's community programs. He didn't tell Elawan about the affiliation. She didn't need to know that the daycare existed, because a man who controlled half the underground economy in Houston had decided that her daughter deserved finger painting and nap time. He found a counselor, Dr. Linnea Thorne, no relation, who specialized in trauma bonding and complex PTSD. She accepted Elawan's insurance. Every door he opened from behind. Every resource he provided, he framed as coincidence or community. He never said, "I did this for you." He said, "I heard about this program," or "someone mentioned this organization." Because he understood something that most powerful men don't. Real power isn't about being seen. It's about making the world move without anyone knowing who pushed. And slowly, like the tide coming in, so gradual that you don't notice until your feet are wet, Elawan began to rebuild. She smiled more. She stood straighter. She started wearing colors, a blue blouse, a yellow scarf, instead of the muted grays and blacks that had been her uniform of invisibility. She moved out of the Cullen Boulevard apartment. Johnny's nonprofit contact found her a subsidized 2-bedroom in a safer complex near the medical center. Close to work, close to Ivy's daycare, close to a park where Rosalind could crawl on grass instead of concrete. The first night in the new apartment, she sat on the floor, no furniture yet, just sleeping bags and a box of kitchen supplies, and looked at the clean white walls and the working lock on the door and the window that didn't rattle when trucks passed. Ivy came and sat beside her. "Is this our house?" she asked. "Yes, baby, this is our house." "Just ours?" "Just ours," Ivy smiled, a real smile. The kind she used to give before she learned to check doorways for danger. "I like it here," she said. "It's quiet." Quiet. The most precious word in their vocabulary. A word that had once meant waiting for the next eruption, and now meant peace. Ivy stopped flinching when doors closed loudly. Rosalind began sleeping through the night, and Johnny, the man with the sealed room in his chest, felt the lock begin to turn. The truth, it happened on a Sunday. Elawan was at Johnny's apartment. The first time she'd been there, he'd invited her for dinner, nothing elaborate. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine she didn't drink because she'd developed an aversion to alcohol that she didn't explain, and he didn't question. Ivy was playing on the living room floor with a set of wooden blocks that Johnny had bought the day before and placed casually on the coffee table as if they'd always been there. Rosalind was asleep in a portable crib that had also appeared with suspicious convenience. After dinner, they sat on the balcony. Houston stretched out below them, a lattice of lights and highways and heat. The air was thick and still. "My attorney told me something today," Elawan said. Johnny's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a tightening, almost imperceptible, like a man bracing for impact. "She said the IRS investigation into Briggs was triggered by an anonymous tip, a detailed one, Someone who knew exactly where to look, who had access to his employment records, his tax filings, his expense reports. Silence. She said the level of precision suggested someone with significant resources. Someone who doesn't just stumble onto that kind of information. Johnny looked at the skyline. He didn't deny it. He didn't deflect. He simply waited. "It was you," Elawan said. Not a question. He turned to her. His eyes, those dark, controlled, calculating eyes, were open in a way she hadn't seen before, unguarded, vulnerable, like a man who has just removed his armor and isn't sure if the air will burn. "Yes," he said. She stared at him. "You followed me home that night, from the supermarket." "Yes." "You watched my apartment. You heard what he said to me." "Yes." "You investigated him. You found the fraud. You handed it to the IRS. I pointed them in the right direction. Why?" The question hung between them like a held breath. "Why would you risk all of that? Your anonymity, your business, your entire world, for a woman you didn't know?" Johnny was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower than she'd ever heard it. Not a whisper, but something close, something private. "Because I've seen what happens when good men do nothing." He paused. "My wife died because I didn't act fast enough. I had the power to protect her, and I hesitated. I calculated. I planned. And while I was planning, someone took her from me." He looked at his hands. "When I saw you in that store, holding your baby, trying to return formula so your daughter wouldn't see you fail, I recognized it. Not you, the situation, the architecture of it, someone being crushed slowly, in a way that no one notices until it's too late." He looked back at her. "I decided I would not be too late again." Elawan's breath caught. Not in shock, in understanding. The kind of understanding that comes when two fractured people look at each other and see their own cracks reflected back. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, "You should have told me. Would you have let me help?" "No. That's why I didn't tell you." Another silence, longer this time, but not empty, full. Full of everything that had happened between a supermarket checkout line and this balcony. Full of formula and silence, and cracked stairwells, and the sound of a child's voice saying again, "I'm not angry," she said. "You have every right to be." "I know. I'm choosing not to be. Because for the first time in my life, someone used their power to protect me instead of control me. And I don't know what to do with that yet, but I know it matters." She reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his. His fingers closed around hers, slowly, carefully, the way you'd hold something you've waited years to touch. Neither of them moved. The city hummed below. The air was warm, somewhere in the apartment. Ivy laughed at something the blocks had done, and Rosalind shifted in her sleep. Then, slowly, like the last page of a book you've been reading all night, Elowen leaned forward, and Johnny, the man who controlled empires from shadows, the man who spoke in silences and moved like smoke, the man who had locked a room in his chest and thrown away the key. Johnny leaned in too. The kiss was not passionate. It was not cinematic. It was slow and soft and tasted like relief. Like the first breath after holding your head underwater. Like the word safe, spoken aloud for the first time. When they pulled apart, she was crying, not in sadness, in arrival. "I don't know what this is," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said. "But I'm not going anywhere." 7 months later, the Kroger on Westheimer, 6:30 p.m. The store was busy this time. Families, couples, a teenager arguing with his mother about cereal brands. The fluorescent lights still buzzed, but the sound didn't bother Elowen anymore. Nothing about this store bothered her anymore. She pushed the cart down the baby formula aisle. Rosalind sat in the cart seat, 12 months old now, babbling with the kind of indiscriminate enthusiasm that only babies and drunk poets possess. Ivy walked beside the cart, carrying a small basket of her own, because Johnny had given it to her last week and told her she was chief assistant shopper, a title she took with devastating seriousness. Elowen reached for the enfamel, the large canister. She placed it in the cart. She went to the checkout. Lane 7. Same register. She swiped her card. Approved. She didn't flinch. She didn't hold her breath. She didn't mentally calculate the remaining balance or rehearse an apology for existing. She just paid, like a person, like a woman who had finally been given the thing she was owed from the beginning. The right to stand in a supermarket and buy food for her child without it being an act of courage. Outside, the Houston evening was still warm, but softer now. The first week of October, when the city remembers that other seasons exist. She loaded the groceries into the back of a Honda Civic. Used, modest, hers. Johnny had found it. She had paid for it. That distinction mattered. She buckled Rosalind into the car seat. Ivy climbed into her booster. And there he was, leaning against his Escalade. 2 spaces over, arms crossed, charcoal suit, no tie. The Patek Philippe catching the last of the daylight. He'd been waiting, not because he needed to, but because there were some things worth standing still for. How was shopping? He asked. Ivy made the cashier scan each item individually so she could watch the price appear. It took 17 minutes. Thorough, I respect that. Ivy appeared at his side. She looked up at him with the same fearless certainty she'd had from the first day. The certainty of a child who has decided something and will not be moved. Johnny. Yeah. Are you staying? He crouched down, eye level, the way he always did. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Ivy nodded. Then she took his hand, small fingers wrapping around 2 of his, and pulled him toward the car. Good. Because you need to help with bath time. Rosalind splashes. Johnny stood up. He looked at Elowen over the roof of the car. She was watching him with that expression again. The one he'd first seen in a checkout line at 9:47 p.m. on a night when the world was broken. But it was different now. The shame was gone. The exhaustion was gone. The performance was gone. What remained was something raw and real and terrifyingly beautiful. A woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unscarred, but unbroken. She smiled. He smiled back. It was the most dangerous thing he'd done in years. They drove home. Ivy sang in the back seat. Rosalind babbled. The city blurred past the windows, lights, and highways, and the endless, sprawling promise of a place that never stops reinventing itself. And Johnny Thorne, the man who had built an empire from shadows, who had dismantled a man's life with a phone call and a file, who had once believed that the sealed room in his chest would stay locked forever. Johnny Thorne drove toward a small apartment with 2 kids in the back seat and a woman beside. Him who had taught him something no amount of power or money could buy. That the bravest thing in the world is not strength, it's staying.